The whispers followed Grace Mitchell through the dusty streets of Silver Creek like a second shadow, growing louder with each passing day as her belly swelled beneath her simple cotton dress. In the Montana Territory of 1876, an unmarried woman with child was scandal enough, but Grace's insistence that Dawson Reed, the territory's most respected rancher and newly elected town councilman, was the father had turned whispers to outright condemnation. "Morning, Grace, Mrs. Hollister called with false sweetness from the general store porch. "Feeling well today?" Her eyes dropped meaningfully to Grace's 7-month belly. "Just fine, thank you," Grace replied, chin held high despite the heat rushing to her cheeks. At 22, she'd grown accustomed to the stares, though they cut no less deeply than they had when her condition first became apparent. The general store bell jingled as Grace stepped inside, the familiar scent of coffee beans and leather goods washing over her. "Mr. Parsons barely acknowledged her from behind the counter, his lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "Just the usual supplies, please," Grace said quietly, placing her list on the counter along with the few coins she could spare. As Mr. Parsons reluctantly gathered her items, the store door opened again. Grace didn't need to turn to know who had entered. The sudden hush told her everything. Dawson Reed's boots clicked against the wooden floor, his commanding presence filling the small shop. "Good day, Mr. Parsons," Dawson said, his deep voice smooth as whiskey. At 34, he was the picture of frontier success, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of a summer storm and a reputation as spotless as his tailored suits. Grace kept her eyes fixed on the counter, counting the seconds until she could leave. 6 months ago, after the Harvest Festival dance, Dawson had walked her home under a canopy of stars. What happened afterward had changed everything for her, at least. For him, it seemed to have changed nothing at all. "Miss Mitchell," Dawson acknowledged stiffly, tipping his hat as propriety demanded. Not a flicker of recognition crossed his face beyond what any gentleman would offer a passing acquaintance. "Mr. Reed," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Mr. Parsons slid her purchases across the counter with obvious disdain. "That'll be 83 cents. Grace counted out her coins carefully. "I'm afraid I only have 78. "Then I suggest you put something back," Mr. Parsons said coldly. Before Grace could decide what necessities she could do without, a large hand appeared, placing a silver dollar on the counter. "Keep the change," said a voice she didn't recognize. Grace turned to find herself looking up at a stranger tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the deep blue of twilight. His clothes were trail-worn, his dark blonde hair a touch too long beneath his battered cowboy hat. A thin scar traced his jawline, disappearing into several days' worth of stubble. "I can't accept that," Grace said quietly. "Already done," the stranger replied with a slight shrug. Seemed the quickest way to move things along. Dawson Reed cleared his throat. "I don't believe we've met." "Dawson Reed." He extended his hand, which the stranger regarded for a moment before shaking. "Declan Boone," the man replied. "Just passing through." "Well, Mr. Boone, Silver Creek welcomes visitors who mind their own business," Dawson said, his politeness barely masking the warning in his tone. Declan's expression remained neutral. "I've always found that what constitutes one's business can be a matter of perspective." Grace gathered her purchases quickly, mumbling thanks before hurrying out the door. She'd nearly reached the end of the street when she heard footsteps behind her. "Miss," Declan Boone called, "you forgot this." He held up a small package of sugar. "Thank you," Grace said, accepting it reluctantly. "And back there, though it wasn't necessary, didn't do it for necessity." His eyes took in her condition without judgment. "Got a place to stay?" Grace stiffened. "I have a home, Mr. Boone, And before you get any ideas, I'm not the kind of woman those people in there think I am. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Never thought you were, just asking a civil question. I have a small homestead just outside town, she relented. My parents left it to me when they passed last year. Managing it alone, I managed just fine, Grace said, though the lie tasted bitter. Truth was, she was barely scraping by. With the baby coming, she'd had to sell off most of the livestock, keeping only 2 milk cows and a few chickens. The vegetable garden kept her fed, but winter was approaching and her stores were meager. Of course you do, Declan said, though his eyes saw too much. Well, good day then, Miss Mitchell, Grace Mitchell, Miss Mitchell. He tipped his hat and turned to leave. Mr. Boone, Grace called after him. When he paused, she continued, people in this town talk, being seen with me. It won't do your reputation any favors. Declan looked back, that half-smile returning. Lucky for both of us, I don't have a reputation worth worrying about. Grace watched him walk away, wondering what had brought such a man to Silver Creek, and why, unlike everyone else she'd encountered since announcing her pregnancy, he'd looked at her without a trace of condemnation. That evening, as Grace prepared a simple supper of cornbread and beans, a knock at her door startled her. Visitors were rare these days. She approached cautiously, sliding the small window cover aside to peek out. Declan Boone stood on her porch, hat in hand, a burlap sack slung over his shoulder. Mr. Boone, she said through the crack after opening the door only slightly. What brings you out here? Passed by earlier, noticed your fence could use some mending before winter sets in. He gestured toward the paddock where her cows grazed. Several posts leaned precariously, the rails between them broken or missing. Thought I might offer my services. I can't pay you, Grace said bluntly. Wasn't asking for payment, just a place to camp for a few days. He nodded toward the creek that ran along the edge of her property. That water looks good for fishing. Grace hesitated. A strange man on her property would only fuel the town gossip, but her practical side couldn't ignore the fact that the fence desperately needed repair before the first snow. You can use the barn, she found herself saying. There's clean straw in the loft. Declan nodded his thanks. I'll start on that fence at first light. True to his word, Grace woke to the sound of hammering the next morning. Through her kitchen window, she watched Declan work, his movements efficient and purposeful. By midday, he'd already replaced 3 posts and secured several rails. When she brought him a dipper of water from the well, he paused, wiping sweat from his brow. You don't strike me as a drifter, Mr. Boone, Grace observed. No. He drank deeply, then handed the dipper back. No. You work too methodically, like a man who's built things meant to last. A shadow crossed his face. Had a spread once, up Montana way. What happened to it? War happened first, then other things. He turned back to the fence post he was setting. That's a story better left untold. Grace didn't press. Everyone in the West carried ghosts, some were just fresher than others. Will you join me for supper? She asked suddenly. It's nothing fancy, but there's plenty. Declan looked up, surprise briefly registering in his eyes. That's kind of you, Miss Mitchell. Grace, she corrected. And it's not kindness. It's a fair trade for honest work. That evening they ate stew at her small table, the conversation flowing more easily than Grace had expected. Declan asked about her homestead, offering practical suggestions for improvements while carefully avoiding personal questions. Grace found herself relaxing in his presence, a rare feeling these days. How long have you been on your own? He finally asked as they finished their meal. My parents died of influenza last autumn, Grace replied. I've been managing since then. And the father, his eyes flickered to her belly, his tone neutral. Grace stiffened. That's not a subject I discuss with strangers. Fair enough. Declan leaned back in his chair. though I suspect there's more to that story than what folks in town believe. People believe what they want to believe, Grace said bitterly, especially when the truth is inconvenient. That's been my experience, Declan agreed quietly. Over the next 3 days, Declan repaired not only the fence but also her leaking roof and the broken step on her porch. Each evening, they shared a simple meal, their conversations gradually growing deeper. Grace learned he'd fought for the Union in the war, though he spoke little of those years. He'd ranched in Montana afterward, until circumstances he wouldn't elaborate on had set him to wandering. "You never said what brought you to Silver Creek," Grace remarked on the 4th evening as they sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold. Declan was silent for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "I've been tracking someone." "A bounty?" Grace asked, surprised. "No, a man who owes a debt." His face had hardened, the lines around his mouth deepening. "Information led me to believe he might be in these parts. And have you found him?" "I believe I have." Declan's eyes held a distant look. "Just confirming a few things before I approach him." "Is it dangerous?" Grace asked, suddenly concerned. A rueful smile touched his lips. "Only to him, if I'm right about what he's done." The next day, Grace ventured into town for her weekly visit to the post office. As she walked past the saloon, raised voices caught her attention. Through the swinging doors, she glimpsed Declan at the bar, engaged in what appeared to be a tense conversation with the bartender. Before she could move on, Dawson Reed emerged from the saloon, nearly colliding with her. "Grace," he said, startled. His eyes narrowed as they darted back toward the saloon. "I see your friend is making inquiries around town. Mr. Boone has been kind enough to help with some repairs at my homestead," Grace replied evenly. "Beyond that, his business is his own." "Is it?" Dawson stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I wonder what he would think if he knew the truth about your condition." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. "You wouldn't dare." "I'm merely suggesting that associating with strangers might not be in your best interest right now." His tone was reasonable, but his eyes held a warning. "People might start asking uncomfortable questions." "The only uncomfortable question is why you continue to deny the truth," Grace replied, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. Dawson's expression hardened. "We've discussed this, Grace. Your delusion is becoming tiresome. I've been patient out of respect for your parents' memory, but my patience has limits." "As does mine," came Declan's voice from behind them. Both turned to find him standing there, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "This is a private conversation, Boone," Dawson said coldly. "Didn't sound private from where I was standing," Declan replied. "Sounded like you were threatening a lady." "You misunderstand the situation entirely," Dawson said with a thin smile. "Miss Mitchell and I have a complicated history." "Not so complicated," Grace interjected, her cheeks flushed with anger. "You just refuse to acknowledge it." "Grace," Dawson sighed with exaggerated patience, "your continued insistence on this fantasy is harmful to yourself, to me, and to my fiancé." The word hit Grace like a physical blow. "Fiancé? Yes, I've asked Miss Emerson to marry me. The announcement will be in next week's paper." Dawson straightened his vest. "All the more reason to put these delusions behind you." "You know I'm not delusional," Grace whispered, fighting back tears. "I know that I never touched you," Dawson replied firmly. "Whatever happened to you, whoever is responsible, it wasn't me." Declan moved closer to Grace, his presence solid and reassuring at her side. "Miss Mitchell, would you allow me to escort you home?" Grateful for the escape, Grace nodded wordlessly. As they walked away, she could feel Dawson's eyes boring into her back. They were halfway home before Grace trusted herself to speak. You must think I'm either a liar or a fool. I don't make judgments without facts, Declan replied evenly. The facts, according to everyone in Silver Creek, are that I'm trying to trap Dawson Reed into marriage by falsely claiming he fathered my child. The words tumbled out, bitter and raw. The facts, according to them, are that I'm either calculating or crazy. And according to you. Grace stopped walking, turning to face him fully. According to me, Dawson Reed courted me discreetly for months after my parents died. He was kind, attentive. He made me feel less alone. After the harvest festival last year, he walked me home and stayed the night. Her voice faltered. When I told him about the baby, he denied everything. Said I was confused, that nothing had happened between us. And you have no proof. What proof could I have? Grace asked desperately. It was just the two of us, his word against mine, and in this town his word is gospel. Declan studied her face intently. Why would he deny it? He's unmarried, financially stable. Taking responsibility would have been the honorable choice. Grace looked away. Dawson has political ambitions beyond Silver Creek. The Emersons are one of the wealthiest families in the territory. Their daughter comes with connections he needs. Her hand moved protectively to her belly. I'm just the orphaned daughter of homesteaders, a complication. They walked in silence for several minutes before Declan spoke again. I believe you, Grace. The simple declaration, delivered without hesitation, nearly undid her composure. Why, you don't know me. I know enough, he replied. I've seen men like Reed before. The kind who craft their public face as carefully as a mask, hiding what lies beneath. That evening, Grace noticed Declan was unusually quiet as they ate. He seemed lost in thought, occasionally studying her with an intensity that made her self-conscious. You're staring, she finally said. Thinking, he corrected. About your situation. It's not your concern, Grace said, though without heat. Maybe it should be. He pushed his plate aside. Grace, how would you feel about leaving Silver Creek? The question caught her off guard. Leaving, to go where? I have connections in Wyoming territory. People who wouldn't ask questions. You could start fresh without the weight of this town's judgment. For a moment, Grace allowed herself to imagine it a new place, free from whispers and condemning glances. Then reality reasserted itself. I can't just run away, she said quietly. This land is all I have left of my parents, and running would only confirm what everyone already believes, that I'm lying. Sometimes surviving is more important than proving you're right, Declan countered. Is that what you did? Grace asked. Run to survive. His expression shuddered. My circumstances were different. Were they? Or did someone powerful hurt you too, knowing they could get away with it? When he didn't answer, she continued more gently. I appreciate the offer, truly, but I need to stay and face this. Even if it means raising your child amid this hostility. Grace's hand moved to her belly, feeling the strong kick of the life within. My baby deserves to know I fought for the truth, that I didn't just disappear when things got difficult. Declan nodded slowly. I respect that decision, even if I think it's a hard road you're choosing. The right paths usually are, Grace replied with a small smile. The next morning, Grace woke to find Declan already gone from the barn. A note pinned to her door simply read, In town on business, back by evening. As promised, he returned as the sun was setting, his expression unreadable as he dismounted from his horse. Where did you go? Grace asked as she met him at the fence line. Had some questions that needed answering, Declan replied, leading his horse toward the barn. Found a few of them. About the man you're tracking, Declan paused, turning to look at her. Yes, about him. Something in his tone made Grace uneasy. Declan, what are you planning to do? Nothing that concerns you, he said, his voice gentler than his words. Best you don't know the details. If it involves Dawson Reed, It absolutely concerns me, Grace insisted, following him into the barn. Declan stopped unsaddling his horse, surprise evident on his face. What makes you think it involves Reed? The way you've been watching him, the questions you've been asking in town. Grace crossed her arms. I'm not blind, Declan. Whatever you're planning, I'm not planning anything that would bring trouble to your door, he interrupted firmly. Trust me on that, at least. But Grace couldn't shake the feeling that Declan was setting something in motion that would change everything. That night, she slept fitfully, troubled by dreams of confrontation and violence. The next day was Sunday, and despite her reluctance to face the town's judgment, Grace dressed for church as she always had. Her parents had instilled in her a faith that ran deeper than the opinions of fallible people. "You're going to church?" Declan asked, surprised, when she emerged from her house in her best dress. "I still believe in God, even if I've lost some faith in his followers," Grace replied. "Will you come?" Declan shook his head. "Been a long time since I darkened a church door. Don't think today's the day to start." The service was as difficult as Grace had anticipated. She sat alone in the last pew, enduring the sidelong glances and whispered comments. Reverend Marshall's sermon on truthfulness and repentance seemed pointedly aimed in her direction, though he never specifically addressed her situation. As the congregation filed out afterward, Grace found herself face to face with Eleanor Emerson Dawson's newly announced fiancé. Eleanor was everything Grace was not: polished, fashionably dressed, and secure in her social position. "Miss Mitchell," Eleanor said, her voice carrying just enough to ensure others would hear. "I've been hoping to speak with you." Grace steeled herself. "Miss Emerson, I wanted to express my sympathy for your situation." Eleanor's perfectly arched eyebrows rose slightly. "It must be terribly difficult, facing motherhood alone." "Thank you for your concern," Grace replied stiffly. "I also wanted to make something clear," Eleanor continued, her voice dropping. "Dawson has explained everything to me, your confusion about what happened. I understand grief can affect the mind in strange ways." Grace felt her cheeks burn. "There's no confusion on my part, Miss Emerson." "Nevertheless," Eleanor pressed on, "now that our engagement is official, I would appreciate it if you would cease these painful allegations. They're distressing to Dawson and by extension to me." Before Grace could respond, a commotion near the church steps drew everyone's attention. Declan Boone stood there, his presence commanding despite his trail-worn appearance. His eyes scanned the crowd until they found Grace. "Miss Mitchell," he called, loud enough for all to hear. "Might I have a word?" A murmur ran through the congregation as Grace made her way toward him, acutely aware of the stares following her. "What are you doing here?" she whispered as she reached him. "Something that should have been done months ago," Declan replied quietly, then more loudly. "I believe you've been looking for me, Mr. Reed." Dawson, who had been speaking with the Reverend, turned slowly. "Looking for you? I think not, Mr. Boone." "No." Declan's voice carried across the churchyard. "That's strange, because I've been looking for you for quite some time now, ever since I learned my sister had died giving birth to your child in Colorado last year." A shocked silence fell over the gathering. Dawson's face drained of color. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Catherine Boone," Declan continued relentlessly. "She worked as a schoolteacher in Denver. You met her while on business there, courted her secretly, promised her marriage. When she told you she was with child, you disappeared. Sound familiar?" "This is absurd," Dawson sputtered, looking around at the shocked faces of his neighbors. "I've never been to Denver." "Haven't you?" Declan pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "Because the Denver Pacific Railway has records of a D. Reed traveling there multiple times last year. And the proprietor of the Grand Hotel remembers you quite well. as does the minister who witnessed your private marriage ceremony to my sister." Gasps erupted from the crowd. Eleanor Emerson clutched her mother's arm, her face ashen. "You're lying," Dawson said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The marriage certificate says otherwise," Declan replied coldly. "As does the letter my sister wrote me before she died, naming you as her husband and the father of her child." Grace stood frozen, the implications of Declan's words washing over her. Not only had Dawson lied about their night together, but he had apparently done the same to another woman with far more tragic consequences. "My sister died believing you would return," Declan continued. "Her child, your son, didn't survive the birth. I've spent the last 6 months tracking you down." "If this is true, why not go to the law?" Reverend Marshall asked, stepping forward. "Because what he did wasn't illegal," Declan said bitterly. "Immoral, yes. Unconscionable, absolutely. But not against the law. I came for justice of a different kind the truth exposed." His eyes turned to Grace. "And then I arrived in Silver Creek and discovered you were preparing to do the same thing again." The crowd's attention swung to Grace, but for once, the looks weren't condemning, they were questioning, uncertain. "This is slander," Dawson declared, though his voice shook slightly. "You have no proof of any of this." "Don't I?" Declan reached into his vest and produced a small daguerreotype. "My sister on her wedding day, with you." He held the image up for all to see. There was no mistaking Dawson Reed standing beside a smiling young woman, their hands joined. Eleanor Emerson pushed forward, snatching the photograph to examine it more closely. Her face crumpled. "Dawson, is this true?" "Eleanor, please," Dawson began, reaching for her arm. "This man is clearly deranged. Answer me," she demanded, recoiling from his touch. "Is this you in this photograph?" Dawson's eyes darted around the crowd, measuring his dwindling options. Finally, his shoulders sagged. "It's complicated." The admission, half-hearted as it was, sent a ripple through the gathering. Eleanor let out a small sob and rushed away, her parents hurrying after her. "If you lied about this," Reverend Marshall said slowly, "then perhaps Miss Mitchell has been telling the truth all along." All eyes turned to Grace, who stood tall despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. "I never lied," she said simply. "Not once." In the chaos that followed, as the townsfolk pressed around Dawson with questions and accusations, Declan gently took Grace's elbow. "Let me take you home," he murmured. Numbly, she allowed him to lead her away from the church, away from the disintegrating reputation of the man who had so thoroughly betrayed her trust. They were halfway down the street when Grace finally found her voice. "You knew. All this time, you knew who he was." "I suspected," Declan corrected. "When I first heard the rumors about your situation, I thought it might be the same man, but I needed to be certain." "That's why you stayed," Grace realized, "to investigate him." "At first," Declan admitted, "but then—" "Then what?" He stopped walking, turning to face her. "Then I got to know you, your strength, your integrity, the way you refused to back down from the truth even when it would have been easier." His eyes held her steadily. "And I knew I couldn't just expose him and leave. You deserved more than that." Grace's heart pounded in her chest. "What are you saying, Declan?" Before he could answer, they were interrupted by the sound of running footsteps. Turning, they saw Dawson Reed approaching, his face contorted with anger. "You've ruined me," he seethed, advancing on Declan. "Years of building my reputation, destroyed in minutes because of your interference." "You ruined yourself," Declan replied calmly, positioning himself slightly in front of Grace. "I just made sure everyone knew about it." "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Dawson demanded. "The Emersons have broken our engagement. The town council is already talking about asking for my resignation. Everything I've worked for gone." "And what about what you did to Grace?" Declan countered. "Or to my sister? Did you consider the lives you were destroying with your lies?" Dawson's gaze shifted to Grace, something calculating entering his expression. "I could still make this right, Grace. Acknowledge the child. Give it my name." The offer so long desired now felt hollow and insulting. "My baby already has a name," Grace said firmly. "Mitchell. And we don't need anything from you." "Don't be foolish," Dawson snapped. "A woman alone with a child, you know what kind of life that is. I'm offering you legitimacy." "She's not alone," Declan said quietly. Dawson's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" Instead of answering him, Declan turned to Grace. "What I was trying to say before we were interrupted. I've come to care for you, Grace. More than I expected, more than I thought possible after everything that's happened." Grace's breath caught in her throat. "Declan, I know it's sudden," he continued. "And I know you have every reason to be wary of men and their promises, but if you'd allow it, I'd like to stay. To help you with the homestead, with the baby, to see if what I'm feeling might grow into something you could share." Dawson let out a harsh laugh. "This is absurd. You barely know each other." But Grace wasn't listening to him anymore. Her focus was entirely on Declan's earnest face, on the genuine emotion she saw there. "You want to stay, even with everything?" Her hand moved to her swollen belly. "Especially with everything," Declan replied. "That child is innocent in all this. And you deserve someone who sees your worth, who values your strength." "This is touching," Dawson interrupted sarcastically. "But Grace, be sensible. You know nothing about this man." "I know he stood up for the truth when it was difficult," Grace replied, not taking her eyes from Declan's. "I know he defended me when no one else would. I know he sees me, really sees me, not as someone to be used, but as someone to be respected." Dawson's face darkened. "You'll regret this decision, Grace. Both of you will." "The only thing I regret," Grace said, finally looking at him, "is ever trusting you in the first place. Goodbye, Dawson." Taking Declan's offered arm, she turned away from her past and toward a future suddenly bright with unexpected possibility. The aftermath of that Sunday's revelations transformed Grace's life in ways she could never have anticipated. The town of Silver Creek, shocked by Dawson Reed's exposed deception, underwent a collective change of heart regarding Grace Mitchell. Where once there had been condemnation, now there was contrition. Where judgment had reigned, now apologies flowed. Mrs. Hollister brought a basket of preserves to Grace's door. "For the baby," she explained awkwardly. "And, well, to say I'm sorry for believing the worst." Mr. Parsons extended credit at the general store. Reverend Marshall paid a personal visit to offer his support. Even Alina Emerson, after the initial shock had worn off, sent a brief note acknowledging that they had both been victims of the same man's duplicity. Dawson Reed himself left town within a fortnight, his political aspirations in tatters, his carefully constructed reputation destroyed. Rumors suggested he'd headed west to California to start anew, a luxury. Grace reflected that he had denied his previous victims. Through it all, Declan remained steadfast at Grace's side. True to his word, he stayed to help with the homestead, repairing the barn, clearing new fields, and preparing the house for winter's approach. More importantly, he gave Grace something she'd nearly forgotten how to accept: unconditional support. "You don't have to do all this," Grace told him one evening as they sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. "I know," Declan replied simply. "I want to. Because you feel responsible for me now, because of what happened with your sister." The question had been weighing on her mind. Declan considered his words carefully. "I came to Silver Creek seeking justice for Catherine. I stay because I found something I wasn't looking for." His eyes met hers. "A future I can believe in again." As autumn progressed into early winter, their relationship deepened beyond either's expectations. Grace found herself sharing secrets she'd never told anyone, her fears about motherhood, her dreams for her child's future, her determination to create something lasting from her parents' legacy. Declan, in turn, gradually revealed the painful chapters of his past. The war that had left him with both physical and invisible scars, the sister he'd failed to save, the years of wandering in search of purpose. "I never thought I'd feel at home anywhere again," he admitted one night as they sat before the fireplace, his hand resting lightly on her swollen belly. "Not after everything that happened." "And now?" Grace asked softly. His eyes held hers. "Now I'm starting to believe that home isn't a place. It's a feeling. It's this." When Grace's labor began on a cold December morning, Declan rode for the midwife with such urgency that he nearly killed his horse in the process. Throughout the long, difficult hours that followed, he paced the small homestead like a caged mountain lion, deaf to the midwife's assurances that Grace's progress was normal. "She's strong," Mrs. Winters told him firmly after checking on Grace for the dozenth time. "And the baby's positioned well. Nature knows what it's doing." Declan nodded tensely, though the memory of his sister's death in childbed haunted him. "Just save them both." "I've delivered half the babies in this county for 30 years, the midwife replied. "Including Grace herself. We'll get through this." Dawn was breaking when the first thin cry pierced the quiet house. Declan, who had finally collapsed into a chair by the fire, leapt to his feet. Mrs. Winters appeared in the doorway, her lined face weary but smiling. "You can come in now," she said. "They're waiting for you." Grace lay propped against pillows, her face exhausted but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up as Declan entered, her smile warming him more thoroughly than any fire could have. "Come meet her," Grace said softly. Declan approached cautiously, lowering himself to the edge of the bed. The infant's face, still red and wrinkled from birth, peered out from the blankets, a wisp of dark hair visible beneath the small cap. "A girl," he breathed, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the tiny hand that had escaped the swaddling. "Danielle Catherine Mitchell," Grace said, watching his face carefully. If that's all right." Emotion constricted Declan's throat as he recognized his sister's name. "It's perfect," he managed. "She's perfect." The baby's fingers instinctively closed around his much larger one, and something shifted permanently in Declan's heart. This child, Grace's child, wasn't his by blood, but in that moment, he knew he would protect her with his life. "I want to ask you something," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "And I understand if it's too soon or if you need time to think about it." Grace's eyes never left his face. "Ask me. Marry me," Declan said simply. "Not because you need protection, or because of the baby, or because of what happened with Reed. Marry me because I love you, Grace Mitchell. Because these last few months have shown me that a life without you in it isn't one I want to live." Tears welled in Grace's eyes. "Declan, are you certain?" "Taking on another man's child, she's your daughter," Declan interrupted gently. "That's all that matters to me. I'll love her as my own, I swear it." Grace shifted the baby slightly so she could reach for his hand. "Then yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." They wed on Christmas Day in the small church that had once been the site of Grace's greatest humiliation. Now, with Reverend Marshall officiating and most of the town in attendance, it became the setting for her greatest joy. Declan stood tall beside her, his Sunday best pressed for the occasion, his eyes never leaving her face as they spoke their vows. "I take you, Grace Mitchell, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the church. "To love and to cherish, to protect and to honor from this day forward, until death parts us." When Grace repeated the words, adding Declan's name where he had spoken hers, she felt the weight of the past year lifting from her shoulders. This man, this unexpected gift who had appeared in her life when she needed him most, had given her back not just her reputation, but her faith in the possibility of happiness. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Marshall declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." As Declan leaned down to seal their union with a kiss, baby Danielle, cradled in Mrs. Winter's arms at the front pew, let out a happy gurgle, as if adding her own blessing to the proceedings. The reception that followed at the town hall was modest but joyful. The same community that had once shunned Grace now celebrated her new beginning, the tables laden with dishes contributed by families eager to make amends for their past judgment. "Mrs. Boone," Declan murmured in her ear as they shared their first dance. "How does it sound?" "Like a new chapter," Grace replied, leaning into his embrace. "For all three of us." As winter settled fully over Silver Creek, the newly formed Boone family established their rhythm in the small homestead. Declan proved to be a natural with Danielle, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he learned to change and swaddle her. On cold nights, Grace often woke to find him pacing the floor with the baby, humming off-key but soothing melodies as Danielle drifted back to sleep against his shoulder. "You're good with her," Grace observed one such night watching from the bedroom doorway. "She makes it easy," Declan replied, though his proud smile betrayed his pleasure at the compliment. "Got your temperament, thankfully, sweet-natured." "And your stubbornness," Grace countered with a laugh. "She won't sleep unless she's ready, no matter how tired we are." "That's not stubbornness," Declan protested. "That's determination." "If that's what we're calling it," Grace teased, moving to join them. As Danielle grew, so did their plans for the homestead. With Declan's experience in ranching and Grace's knowledge of the land, they began to transform the struggling property into something sustainable. They expanded the vegetable garden, repaired the chicken coop, and acquired 2 more milk cows. Declan used his savings to purchase a small herd of cattle, the beginning of what they hoped would become a profitable enterprise. "We'll need to expand the north pasture come spring," he said one evening as they pored over a rough map of the property. "And that creek needs to be dammed for better irrigation. And a larger house, eventually," Grace added, "especially if we—" "If we what?" Declan prompted when she hesitated. A blush colored Grace's cheeks. "If our family grows," Declan's eyes softened. "Is that something you'd want?" "More children. With you," Grace met his gaze steadily. "Yes, very much." Their life wasn't without challenges. The harsh Montana winter tested their resources and resilience. A late blizzard in March nearly cost them 2 calves, saved only by Declan's determination to check the herd hourly throughout the night. The roof leaked during the spring thaw, forcing them to move their bed 3 times before Declan could make proper repairs. But through it all, they faced each obstacle together, their partnership growing stronger with each challenge overcome. By Danielle's first birthday, the homestead had transformed not just physically, with its repaired fences and expanded fields, but spiritually. It had become a true home, filled with laughter and love and possibilities. The celebration of that milestone brought the first letter from Denver, a response to inquiries Declan had sent regarding his sister's estate. Catherine Boone had left behind a small inheritance, held in trust by a local banker who had been searching for her next of kin. "It's not much," Declan explained as he read the letter to Grace, "but enough to make a difference for us, for Danielle." "What will you do with it?" Grace asked. Declan considered the question thoughtfully. "I think Catherine would want it used for Danielle's future, perhaps for education when she's older." "I think that's perfect," Grace agreed, watching their daughter toddle unsteadily across the floor, her determination evident in every wobbly step. A legacy from her namesake. As their second year together began, Grace discovered she was expecting again. The news filled Declan with both joy and trepidation. Memories of his sister's fate still haunted him, despite his efforts to focus on the present. "I'm not Catherine," Grace reassured him gently when she recognized the worry in his eyes. "And this isn't Denver. Mrs. Winters is the best midwife in the territory, and we're prepared this time." Declan nodded, placing a protective hand over her still flat stomach. "I know. I just can't help but worry about you both." "Both of us will be fine," Grace promised. "This baby is a blessing, Declan, a symbol of everything we've built together." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through spring and summer. Danielle, now nearly 2, seemed to understand something important was happening. She patted Grace's growing belly with solemn concentration, occasionally pressing her ear against it as if listening for secrets. "Baby," she would announce proudly, one of her first clear words. "That's right, sweetheart," Grace would reply. "Your brother or sister is growing in there." The community that had once judged Grace so harshly now rallied around the Boone family. Women who had once whispered behind their hands now brought baby quilts and hand-me-down cradles. Men who had avoided Grace's gaze now offered Declan help with the autumn harvest, ensuring the family would be well prepared for the coming winter. "Funny how things change," Mrs. Winters remarked during one of her regular visits to check on Grace's progress. 2 years ago, this town couldn't wait to run you off. Now they're falling over themselves to help." "People can surprise you," Grace replied without bitterness, "for better or worse." "Speaking of surprises," the midwife continued, her hands gently probing Grace's rounded abdomen, "this little one seems eager to make an appearance. I'd say you're farther along than we calculated." Indeed, the baby arrived 2 weeks earlier than expected, on a crisp October evening as the leaves were turning gold. The labor was mercifully shorter than with Danielle, though no less intense. This time, Declan was better prepared, following Mrs. Winters' instructions with calm efficiency, supporting Grace through each contraction with steady hands and encouraging words. "You're doing beautifully," he murmured against her temple as she worked through a particularly difficult pain. "Almost there, my brave girl." When their son finally entered the world with a lusty cry, the tears that streaked Declan's face were of pure joy. "He's here," he whispered, watching in awe as Mrs. Winters cleaned and swaddled the infant. "Grace, he's perfect." "Let me see him," Grace said eagerly, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. The midwife placed the bundle in her arms, and Grace pulled back the blanket to reveal a robust baby boy with a shock of dark hair and Declan's determined chin. "Daniel James Boone," she announced, looking up at her husband. "A strong name for a strong boy." "Daniel and Danielle," Declan chuckled, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed to better admire his son. "That won't be confusing at all." "We'll manage," Grace replied with a tired smile. "We always do." As Daniel grew from infant to toddler, the homestead continued to prosper under their combined care. The cattle herd expanded, providing enough income for modest improvements to the house and barn. Danielle, now 4, became her father's shadow, insisting on helping with every chore from feeding chickens to mending fences. "She has your eye for detail," Declan told Grace proudly after Danielle had meticulously sorted seed potatoes by size without being asked. "And your determination." "I thought we were calling that stubbornness," Grace teased, echoing their old joke. Life settled into the comfortable rhythm of seasons. Planting and harvesting, calving and branding, the cyclical work that defined existence on the frontier. With each passing year, the painful memories of Grace's earlier ordeal faded further, replaced by the joyful chaos of family life. Occasionally, news of Dawson Reed reached Silver Creek. He had indeed gone to California, where he'd attempted to establish himself in Sacramento society. But rumors of his past had followed him, making it difficult to achieve the political prominence he'd once envisioned. The last anyone had heard, he'd moved further west to San Francisco, still searching for the respect and position that had once seemed his birthright in Montana. Do you ever wonder what might have happened if he'd simply acknowledged Danielle from the beginning? Grace asked Declan one evening as they watched their children play before the fire. Declan considered the question carefully. I suppose he'd be raising your daughter and I'd still be wandering, carrying my sister's memory like a weight. His eyes met hers. I can't wish for that, Grace, even knowing the pain his denial caused you. Neither can I, Grace admitted, leaning against his shoulder. Not when this is the result. As their 5th anniversary approached, Declan surprised Grace with plans for the larger house they'd long discussed, but never quite managed to begin. I've been setting aside lumber, he explained, showing her the rough sketches he'd drawn. And I've arranged for the Jameson brothers to help with the framing come spring. 3 bedrooms upstairs, a proper kitchen, and a sitting room where you can finally have that piano you've been wanting. Grace examined the plans with growing excitement. It's beautiful, Declan. But can we afford it now? The cattle sale last month did better than I expected, he replied. And I've been saving a little from each harvest. It's time, Grace. This place has served us well, but our family deserves room to grow. The new house rose gradually over the following year, each beam and board representing another step toward the future they'd built together. When it was finally completed, a sturdy 2-story structure that dominated the homestead, they celebrated with a housewarming that brought the entire community to their door. To the Boones, Reverend Marshall toasted, raising his glass of cider, who have shown us all the power of perseverance, forgiveness, and love. And to Silver Creek, Declan added, his arm around Grace's waist, for becoming the home we needed. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the children were asleep in their new rooms, Grace and Declan stood on the porch of their new house, gazing out at the land that had witnessed their journey. Did you ever imagine this? Grace asked softly. When you first rode into Silver Creek, searching for justice for your sister. Not in my wildest dreams, Declan admitted. I came looking for the past, but found my future instead. Grace turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. I was thinking about what the Reverend said tonight, about perseverance. There were so many moments when it would have been easier to give up, to accept Dawson's denial, to leave town, to believe what everyone was saying about me. But you didn't, Declan said, his voice filled with pride. You stood your ground. Because sometimes the truth is all we have, Grace replied, and sometimes it's enough. Declan drew her into his arms, holding her close against the cool evening air. More than enough, he murmured against her hair. It brought us here. As they stood together, the homestead spread out before them, the fields they'd planted, the barn they'd rebuilt, the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. Grace thought about the long, winding path that had led to this moment. From despair to hope, from isolation to belonging, from scandal to respect. None of it had come easily, but all of it had been worth the struggle. I love you, Declan Boone, she whispered against his chest, for believing in me when no one else would, for helping me build this life. And I love you, Grace Boone, he replied, his voice rough with emotion, for teaching me that second chances are possible. That home is wherever you are. Above them, stars spread across the Montana sky like diamonds scattered on velvet, bearing witness to their journey past, present, and the promise of all the years to come. Two souls who had found each other against all odds, creating from pain and loss something beautiful and enduring. A family, a legacy, a love strong enough to overcome the harshest judgment and the deepest betrayal. In the quiet of the night, with their children sleeping safely under the new roof they'd built together, Grace and Declan sealed their promise with a kiss, not an ending, but the continuation of a story that had only just begun.